Hello there and welcome. Tonight I invite you to slow your breath, soften your thoughts, and let me lead you into the hushed shadows of an older time. A time where wind howled through glens, snow blanketed the heathered hills, and life clung like moss to the stone bones of the earth. We're venturing into medieval Scotland, a land of myth, of mountains and of merciless winters. Over the course of 15 quiet chapters, I'll guide you through frozen lochs and creaking castles, tell you of villagers huddled together against the cold, of silent forests crackling with unseen presence, and of how the Scottish people survived and were shaped by the long, brutal winters that settled over their homeland. So gather close, tuck yourself beneath the warm quilt of imagination, and let your mind wander. Now, let's begin. The snow arrived not all at once, but like a secret told slowly. It would begin in the high passes far above the tree line, where no roads dared to climb, and only the hardiest of sheep still wandered. A quiet dusting on the shoulders of the cairngorms, a soft veil over the quillins on Skye. There, in the lonely white silence, winter took its first breath. For the people in the glens and low crofts, it was the hush before the storm that warned them. A stillness in the air, as if the land itself was waiting. Streams slowed, birds fell silent, even the wind changed, blowing from the north in a sharper tongue. In medieval Scotland, especially during the colder centuries between the 13th and 15th, winters were not merely seasons. They were adversaries. They were tests. They were gods that came to see what or who might be left standing in the thaw. Before the snow ever reached the village, the preparations had already begun. Every family, no matter how poor, knew what had to be done. Salted meat, turned barley, knitted wool, root vegetables buried deep in straw-lined pits, and always peat. Blocks of it stacked like little brown bricks beside every hearth, a lifeline. The smell of burning peat was the smell of survival. The small stone houses, thick-walled and low to the ground, were built not for comfort, but for endurance. Thatch for insulation, sod packed into every crevice, and sometimes even turf laid atop the roofs, blending the homes into the earth like mounds of hibernating creatures. Inside, there might be only a single room, a fire in the centre, a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape, no chimneys yet, not for most. And in that single room, the family slept. All of them. Mother, father, children, grandparents if they were still alive, even the animals sometimes. Chickens, a lamb or two, a half-sick calf. Their breath warmed the room, their bodies made a kind of collective heat. Outside, the world turned pale. The trees lost their leaves, but not all their voices. You could still hear them, groaning in the wind like old men. The rivers became edged in ice. The sky, once brilliant with summer stars, grew heavy with grey. It's easy now to think of snow as something romantic, something we long for at Christmas, something soft and picturesque. But in the Scotland of long ago, snow was a harbinger of hunger, a blanket not of beauty but of burden. For the poor, and there were many, winter was a reckoning. You had what you had, no more. If you'd failed to harvest enough turnips, or if your cow had died in the autumn, or if the roof had collapsed before the first frost, then winter was a sentence you might not see the end of. And yet they endured, because the Scots were a people shaped by the land. Weathered like the rocks that dotted the moors, they sang to each other on dark nights. They told tales of selkies and snow spirits. They believed in omens and in each other. Children would huddle near the hearth and listen to old voices speak of Cailleach, the winter goddess, the veiled hag of the mountains who rode the storms and froze the rivers with her staff. She was feared, yes, but also respected, for she was not evil, only cold. You see, in those days, winter was not the enemy. Winter was an elder, unyielding, stern, but not malicious. If you heeded her rules, you lived. If you forgot them, you perished. There are accounts buried in the fragments of old monastic records and travel journals that speak of entire villages snowed in for weeks, of wolves returning to the forests of the south, of monks chipping ice from their cloister wells to draw water for their prayers. In the Highlands especially, where the land rose up like the bones of giants, the snow could fall for days without pause. And the winds, oh, the winds, they shrieked like banshees in the narrow passes. People tied ropes between their homes and the barns just to find their way through the whiteouts. Some winters were worse than others. The Great Winter of 1434, they called one of them. Stories said the lochs froze solid enough to ride a horse across, that cattle froze upright in the fields, that even the sea turned sluggish, slowed by the cold. But time in those winters did not move quickly. It flowed like syrup, measured not in hours but in tasks, the cutting of wood, the feeding of animals, the mending of a boot. A single loaf of oat bread shared slowly, reverently, like a sacred thing. The long nights were the hardest. Darkness fell early, sometimes by mid-afternoon, and it lingered heavy and vast until well after dawn. Candles were precious, rushlights even more so. Often there was only the fire, glowing low, soft like a heartbeat, yet even in the deep of winter life did not vanish. It only changed shape. Some clans gathered in sealids, secret little gatherings where music and song gave warmth when fire could not. The pipes would play, feet would stomp, and for a few moments frost gave way to laughter. But laughter was precious, because winter did not forget. Come February, some would begin to fall ill, a cough that never stopped, a wound that wouldn't heal. Children faded first, then the old. The ground was too hard to dig graves, so sometimes the dead were kept in outbuildings until the thaw. Still, each sunrise was a victory. Each morning when the frost lifted from the inside of the windows, yes, the inside, was a quiet triumph. And when the snow finally began to melt in March, revealing the sodden brown beneath, people wept. Not with joy, but with exhaustion, because they had made it. Not all of them, but enough, and the land too would begin again. But that is only the beginning. For the true heart of winter's story lies not only in the ice, but in those who dared to dance in its shadow. Let us continue this tale when you're ready. The first true bite of winter in medieval Scotland often arrived on a whisper of wind, a wind that slipped through the stone cracks of croft walls, wound its way beneath the heaviest of woolen cloaks, and found its rest in the marrow of the bones. By the time November settled in, the people already lived in winter's embrace. But it was in December, the darkest month, that the season revealed its truest self. To walk outside after sundown in December was to enter a world almost otherworldly. The snow, when it fell, muffled the land until it felt like sound itself had gone to sleep. The sky hung heavy and low, clouds like smoke draped across mountain tops, and on nights when the moon broke through, it cast the hills in silver, a ghostly world where even trees looked like figures watching from afar. For the villagers, movement became cautious. Paths disappeared beneath drifts. Landmarks changed. Familiar glens became foreign terrain, and every footstep had to be measured, for beneath the snow there were traps, frozen brooks, hidden rocks, and ice-slicked moss. Children were kept close. They were more prone to wander, lured by the beauty of frost or the promise of a game. But too many stories warned of little ones who followed a deer track into the trees and were never seen again. Some said the forest took them, others blamed the Cailleach. But all agreed the land in winter was not empty. It watched. Inside the homes, life folded inward. Mornings began with the stoking of the hearth, often from a few faint embers kept alive through the night. If the fire died, the cold could bite through the thatch like a wolf through sheep's wool. No one dared wake to a dead hearth. The eldest in the household often rose first. Stiff joints and brittle fingers warmed slowly by the fire they rebuilt. Children were roused later, bundled in layer upon layer. Blankets weren't common for most. Instead, old cloaks, woolen scraps, or animal hides did the job. Breakfast, such as it was, would be thin porridge if oats remained. Sweetening it with honey was rare. Dried fruits, rarer still. And meat? That was for the evening, if at all. A bit of dried mutton or salted fish might be cut into the soup, but much had to be rationed. Every mouthful was counted. And yet, there were rituals to the days. Each task, however small, became a kind of rhythm, a way to mark time in a world where clocks were few and days were indistinct. Water was fetched, carefully, from streams now layered with brittle crusts of ice. Wood or peat was brought in, each piece laid with care. Tools were checked, animal shelters repaired, threads spun by firelight. There was no waste in winter. Even silence had its place. Conversations softened, voices dropped. Whether out of reverence or fatigue, no one spoke loudly in the cold months. Words were shared like bread, gently with intention, and in the stillness, stories grew. It was in these quiet hours that the oral traditions of Scotland thrived. Around the hearth, when the winds howled just outside the walls, tales were told. Of warriors who braved the blizzards to reach lost kin. Of lovers turned to stone by a snowbound curse. Of fae folk who danced across frozen locks under starlit skies, beckoning those foolish enough to follow. These stories were more than distractions. They were warnings, memories, lessons veiled in myth. For within each tale was a kernel of truth about survival. Even the church, dominant in every corner of life, recognised the power of the season. The monasteries, often better prepared than the peasants, kept records not just of the weather but of behaviour. They noted a rise in confessions during winter, a spike in illness, and always deaths. The monks prayed for the souls of those who had no fire. In towns and manors, the experience differed, though not as much as one might think. Yes, the wealthier had access to more food, thicker walls, better cloaks, and actual windows, but even stone towers grew damp with cold. Even noble fingers ached with frostbite. And sometimes even gold could not buy enough fuel to last the season. Some lords imposed winter levies, taxes paid in peat, meat, or wool, to fill their own stores. This deepened resentment among the villagers, whose own supplies dwindled quickly. It was not uncommon for quiet thefts to occur, a missing chicken here, a few logs gone there. In harsh years, trust frayed like an old shawl. And yet, there were moments of shared humanity. The festival of Yule, long before and alongside the Christian observance of Christmas, offered a spark of light in the dark. It was an ancient observance, tied to the turning of the sun, and its rituals ran deep in the bones of the people. Even in the leanest years, a Yule log would be chosen, often the largest they had. It would be burned in the hearth for days, a symbol of continuity and hope. Children would be told that if the flame survived through the night, the year ahead would be kind. Offerings were made, not just to the church, but to the land itself. Bread for the birds, a little ale left outside for the spirits, a candle lit at the edge of the wood. For all the hardship, winter in medieval Scotland was not only a season of death, it was a season of reverence. To the people of that time, snow was not just cold, it was memory. Each flake that fell carried the breath of ancestors. Each storm was a voice echoing from the hills. The land did not forget, and neither did they. And always, always they watched the horizon. For the sun, though one, always returned. And that hope, fragile as frost on a morning window, was enough. Enough to endure, enough to dream, enough to see the next page of winter unfold in its own time. Snowfall, to the medieval Scots, was not a novelty. It was an arrival. A signal that the world had crossed a threshold from surviving the tail end of autumn to entering the deep, hollow belly of winter. And with each flake that drifted through the grey sky, it whispered one thing. The rules had changed. By January, the season was at its fullest stretch. The holidays had passed. Whatever warmth Yule had offered was now a fading ember. This was the time of true endurance, when the festive flickers had died and only the long, slow trudge through darkness remained. January days were not so much lived as endured. The sun crept low along the horizon, giving only a few hours of dim light before retreating again. Some days the sun didn't appear at all, hidden behind a thick curtain of cloud. It was as though the heavens had turned inward, just like the people below. Those who had managed their stores well moved cautiously, rationing every morsel. Barrels of salted fish were opened with care, their contents counted and stretched. Ale, once drunk freely in autumn, was now sipped slowly, both a comfort and a medicine. Dried fruits, wrinkled and dark, were prized like treasure. And oatcakes, hard, dry and enduring, became the staple of nearly every meal. For the children, food was often not enough. They grew thin, their cheeks less rosy with each passing week. Parents told stories not just to entertain, but to distract, to guide their minds away from the growling of their stomachs or the sting of chilblains on their feet. The cold crept into everything. It nested in the thatch above, froze the water in the wooden pails and cracked the joints of the elderly. Even the breath that curled from mouths in misty trails seemed reluctant to leave the body. In the churches, priests recited psalms wrapped in furs. Their voices echoed through stone halls, their words catching in their throats not from devotion, but from the sheer chill that turned even holy spaces into icy chambers. But the faithful still came, not for warmth, but for something stronger, the comfort of prayer, of ritual, of belief in something larger than the cold that pressed against their skin. In monasteries, monks wore extra robes and layered woolen hoods. Yet still, fingers froze on ink-stained quills, illuminated manuscripts paused mid-page. The ink sometimes thickened in its bottle, reluctant to flow. Yet it was not just the cold that made January fearsome. It was the stillness. The roads, if one could call them that, were treacherous now, not just because of ice, but because of who or what might lie beneath it. Snow concealed pitfalls. Frozen puddles swallowed boots. Even sound was lost, muffled by the great white hush that covered the glens and passes. Travel became dangerous not only for the threat of exposure, but for the risk of never finding your way again. Shepherds tied ropes from cottage to barn, not just during storms, but even on calm days, just in case a whiteout came suddenly. And they did, without warning. The hills could vanish in minutes. What had once been a familiar stretch of field could become an unmarked tomb. It was during these weeks that stories of disappearances spread. A woodsman gone to check his traps and never returning. A boy chasing after a stray dog and fading into the snow. An old woman seen walking toward the moor, her shawl flapping like wings, then nothing. These stories weren't told to frighten, though they certainly did. They were told because the people needed to remember. To understand that winter was not only a season but a force, ancient, impartial and very much alive. But even amidst all this, there were sparks of resistance. In the villages, women spun wool by the fire, the soft whir of the spindle a lullaby of resilience. Men repaired tools, sharpened blades, mended boots and carved trinkets to sell or trade, and spring returned. Life was reduced to its simplest acts, and in that reduction there was a kind of clarity. Neighbours looked out for one another more closely in January than in any other month. A loaf of bread left quietly on a doorstep. A few sticks of firewood shared with the widow at the edge of the hamlet. Not out of charity, out of understanding. No one knew who would still be there in April. In some crofts, herbs were brought out, dried sage, yarrow, mint and angelica, stored from the warmer months. Wives brewed broths and teas, hoping to ward off fever or soothe a racking cough. When those failed, they turned to more ancient remedies, charms sewn into clothing, whispered blessings over sleeping children, offerings left under certain trees whose names were no longer spoken aloud. And sometimes they simply waited. Because much of life in winter was not about doing. It was about being, holding on, listening to the wind, counting the days with notches on the doorframe or seeds in a bowl. Watching the fire and letting time pass like the slow melt of ice on a stone. The animals too suffered, though they made no complaint. Cows huddled in corners of low-roofed byres, chickens grew silent, dogs curled tightly beside the hearth, dreaming of spring fields. Even the ravens, once so bold, flitted less frequently across the sky, their black wings like shadows on a frozen canvas. And the land, as always, held its secrets. Sometimes, if one stood still long enough, the wind would carry with it a sound, not of voices exactly, but of memory, as though the hills remembered every winter that had come before, the birth cries, the last breaths, the laughter that had dared to echo even in the snow. So when the people looked out over their frost-laced fields and up to the white-crowned peaks beyond, they did so not with fear, but with reverence, for winter did not hate them, it simply did not care. And in that indifference, the people found a strange kind of strength, a steadiness that could not be frozen or shaken loose, a warmth that came not from fire, but from the quiet defiance of endurance. January would not last forever, but while it did, they would remain. By the time February rolled across the Scottish hills, it arrived not with gentleness, but with an icy persistence. A month often forgotten in grandeur, but never in hardship. February was no reprieve, not truly, but a deepening, a tightening of the grip that winter had laid upon the land. It was during this month that time grew thin and brittle. Days stretched, yes, but only by minutes. The light returned slowly, as if testing the world's readiness for it. But the cold? The cold stayed. If anything, it became sharper, more cunning. It no longer bludgeoned the people with storms. It whispered instead, seeping through every gap in stone, settling in lungs, lingering in joints. February brought a different kind of silence. The snow fell less, but the frost thickened. It laced the edges of window slits, crept across the wooden beams of ceilings, and glazed every surface before dawn. The once fluffy snowdrifts of December had compacted into hardened crusts, grey with ash and soot. Each footstep crunched with a finality that seemed to echo off the hills. And the people, well, by now they were thin. Not always in body, though many had lost weight, but in spirit. Hope was a currency doled out in whispers. Some spoke of the coming thaw, but most didn't dare. To speak of spring was to summon disappointment. The stores were nearing empty. Barrels scraped the bottom, sacks sagged with hollowness. Those who had salted too little, dried too late, or simply faced misfortune, they now bartered for scraps. A worn pair of gloves for a handful of meal, a carved charm for half a rabbit. Pride had no place in February. Still, there was motion, always motion. The men who had once tended fields now hunted, not for sport, but for survival. They tracked deer through brittle underbrush, waited hours in stillness for a hare's shadow to move. Their eyes sharpened, their hands grew deft. The kill was never wasted. Meat for stew, bones for broth, hide for warmth. Nothing was left unused. Women, meanwhile, became healers, seamstresses, and quiet architects of resilience. They patched worn garments for the 5th time. They boiled roots with careful precision. They coaxed smiles from children too tired to play. And when they cried, which they did, it was in silence, so as not to frighten those who still clung to them for safety. And in February, the dead began to outnumber the living. You'd know it by the stillness in certain homes. The smoke no longer rising, the door remaining shut even at midday. Some deaths were known, a man buried in snow just beyond the next rise, a babe who never woke from sleep, a grandmother whose breath slowed with the cold and simply stopped. But others were quiet disappearances. A shepherd who didn't return, a widow who wandered out with no cloak, no one asked why. They simply lit a candle in their own hearth and kept the door closed tighter that night. The ground, still frozen solid, could not take the dead, so they waited, respectfully, grimly. Bodies were laid in barns, wrapped in cloth, guarded from the animals. There was no ceremony in this, only necessity. Burial would come with the thaw. Yet in all this darkness, there was still some flame. It flickered faintly in corners, in the telling of stories, in the sharpening of a blade, in the brushing of a child's hair. The people had learned to live inside the cold, not just against it. They no longer cursed the wind, they listened to it. They didn't fear the silence. They filled it with quiet songs. It was during these weeks that old customs resurfaced. Candlemas on the 2nd of February was one such moment, an echo of both pagan and Christian roots. The lighting of candles, a symbol of purification, of returning light. It was not grand, there were no feasts, but even one small flame flickering in a cold room gave the impression of possibility. Some villagers would leave candles by the thresholds of their homes, believing the returning light would guide blessings inside. Others etched protective signs into doorposts, small runes handed down through generations, marks not seen by church nor sanctioned by crown, but remembered nonetheless. The line between survival and belief grew thin in February, and in that liminal space the world felt ancient again. A place where spirits moved alongside men, where the stones had voices and the forest's eyes. Children whispered of strange shapes beyond the tree line. A fox that watched but never ran, a light in the bog that didn't flicker like fire should. They weren't frightened, not truly. They were taught to respect, not to run. The animals sensed it too. Horses grew restless, sheep huddled closer, dogs barked at nothing. Even the crows, usually so bold, circled more warily. The world seemed to pause as though something was being waited for, some secret not yet ready to be spoken. And perhaps it was, because beneath the snow, beneath the cold earth, beneath the frozen lochs and silent hills, life stirred. Not much, just the faintest twitch of a root, the slow unfurling of something green against the ice. A signal too small for most to notice, but there. Imbolc, the old Gaelic festival marking the very earliest signs of spring, hovered like a ghost in the thoughts of the people. It was celebrated not with trumpets, but with stillness, a recognition that winter was a long road, but not a forever one. And so they waited. They waited with empty hands and guarded hearts. They waited with stories whispered over coals and prayers muttered in barns. They waited while the land dreamed beneath its blanket of frost. February was not a time for glory, it was a time for patience, a breath held, a match lit, a promise unspoken but remembered all the same. By March, the shape of winter began to change, not with sudden warmth, nor with any grand announcement, but with small betrayals. A drop of water sliding from an icicle, a patch of brown earth peeking through the snow, the distant tentative call of a bird that had been silent for months. And yet these signs were deceptive. March was not spring. Not in the highlands, not in the valleys where frost still clung to the stone fences like stubborn ghosts. The people of medieval Scotland had seen too many false thaws to be fooled. They knew that winter did not simply leave, it lingered, it fought to stay. The weather shifted in strange ways now. Some days came with warmth, enough to tempt a man to shed his cloak, to open a door and let air that didn't bite. But then, without warning, a storm would return. A burst of snow driven sideways by wind, ice hardening overnight across paths that had only begun to melt. The old folk called it the wolf's breath, the last snarl of winter before it slunk back into the mountains. Still, the changes were there, even if they were subtle. Snow became slush, slush became mud, and with the mud came mess. The thaw brought a world that had been hidden beneath layers of ice and snow, rotting hay, dead animals long buried by storms, the bones of a lost sheep, the spilled contents of a collapsed shed. It was a grim kind of revelation, this uncovering, a reminder of what the cold had taken. In villages and crofts, the people began to emerge more often, blinking against the pale sun, shoulders hunched against the wind. They moved slowly, as if unsure whether the world could be trusted again. They walked the perimeters of their fields. They checked fences for damage. They dug their fingers into the earth, testing its thaw. Children were the first to embrace the change. Their laughter, scarce since December, returned in brief spurts. They kicked at the melting snowbanks, threw muddy clumps instead of snowballs, and marvelled at the sight of puddles that reflected the sky. Women shook out furs, hung cloaks on rough lines to air, and swept the floors of soot and straw. They moved with quiet resolve, measuring what had survived and what had not. A cracked pot, a cloak too thin to mend again, the absence of a favoured hen. Everything was noted, nothing forgotten. The men turned to tools. They sharpened plough blades dulled by disuse. They oiled hinges, checked harnesses, repaired the stone walls that had slumped beneath the weight of snow. Their movements were not hurried, they could afford mistakes, but they carried a kind of anxious readiness. The land would soon need them, and the land, it groaned. The thaw made it unstable. Hillsides that had slept beneath a thick blanket now gave way in small avalanches of mud. Streams overflowed. Paths became treacherous with muck. The roads between villages, never easy at the best of times, became sucking, clinging stretches of brown and grey. Still, there was life, new sounds, a stirring beneath the silence. At dawn, the calls of migrating geese could sometimes be heard, faint, high cries against the pale sky. Crows grew bold again, perching on fence posts, cawing as if to claim the season. Even the sheep bleated more loudly, as if aware that their world was shifting. But the greatest change was in the people's eyes. They were no less tired, no less hungry. Their hands were still chapped, their cheeks still hollow. But there was something behind their gaze now, a flicker that had been absent in January, a readiness, a warning to winter that its reign was ending, no matter how it resisted. And with this readiness came memory. The people remembered the old ways, the seasonal markers passed down through generations. They watched the rowan trees for buds. They checked the streams for frogs. They hung tokens on the elder bushes, gifts to the spirits of the land, not out of superstition, but out of gratitude. For though the snow still fell in bursts, though the wind still chilled the spine, though the stores were nearly bare, they had made it. Or most of them had. In March the burials began. Those who had passed during the freeze were finally laid to rest. The ground, now softened, was opened. Graves were dug, crosses carved, stones laid. It was not a time of mourning that had come and gone. It was a time of acknowledgement, of placing the past beneath the earth so that the present could grow. These ceremonies were quiet, no pomp, no wealth, just a gathering of kin, a priest's blessing, a shared silence as the soil covered what was lost. And then always, work resumed. Because March was not spring, it was not the reward, it was the preparation. Soon, Seeds would need to be planted, fences raised, livestock bred, tools wielded with purpose. The hunger had not passed. In fact, it was at its peak, but the hope of food had returned, and with it, motion. Evening still came early, though not as early as before. Fires still burned, though lower. Meals remained meagre. But in the firelight, the stories began to shift. Less about survival, more about future things. A child born when the snow began to fall, a field they would till again. A wedding delayed until the ground was soft enough for dancing. It was not joy that filled these rooms, not yet, but it was something close. And outside, the world shivered in its thaw, uncertain, reluctant, but changing all the same. April arrived not with gentleness, but with a strange, uneven rhythm, a time of contradiction, of beginnings laced with reminders of hardship. It was the month where winter and spring fought their quiet battle across the ridges and glens of medieval Scotland, neither fully yielding, neither fully dominant. The land, no longer frozen but not yet forgiving, bore the marks of both seasons. The snow had retreated to the high passes, but its memory lingered in every puddle, every clump of matted grass pressed flat by months of weight. The ground was slick and heavy, unwilling to dry. Shoes sank, carts stuck. Hooves churned the roads into brown ruts that swallowed wheels whole. Yet there was beauty, too. Pale green shoots, timid but determined, pushed through the muck. Trees stirred from their long silence, their branches budding cautiously like someone poking a head from beneath a thick blanket, unsure if it was safe to rise. Birds returned in greater numbers now, not just the crows and ravens who had stayed through winter, but larks, sparrows and thrushes, their songs fluttering like ribbons over the fields. The people of the land greeted April not with celebration, but with a kind of guarded relief. They had made it through the worst, but they knew the danger had not passed. Hunger still walked among them, and now the real work began. Fields had to be readied. Every hand, young, old, strong or frail, was needed. The ploughs, dragged from their resting places, were inspected with the eye of those who could not afford a mistake. Oxen were yoked, soil was turned, the scent of earth, rich, wet and pungent, filled the air, and though it made boots heavy and fingers raw, it also stirred something deep in the bones, a memory, a promise. Planting began, oats first in the northern hills where they could withstand the chill, barley next in the lower glens, peas, beans, all humble crops but vital. The seeds were small, often saved from last year's harvest, tucked away in jars or cloth pouches hidden from mice and moisture. They were handled with reverence, for each one was a hope. No one wasted movement in April. The days were longer, yes, but not enough. Rain could come without warning. A late frost could wipe out what little had been planted. Every task was done with urgency, but not panic. The Scots knew the pace of the land. They moved with it as dancers follow the rhythm of a drum. Inside the homes, changes came too. The fires no longer burned day and night. The doors were left open, if only for a little while, to let the air move through. Bedding was shaken out, furs beaten free of lice, floors scrubbed. It was not a grand spring cleaning, but a return, a way of rejoining the world beyond the hearth. And with the shifting season came the return of voices, those that had quieted through the winter. Gossip flowed again in the markets, bargains were struck, friendships rekindled, disputes too reawakened, long simmering tensions over land, over livestock, over loyalties. But such was life. Life meant motion, motion meant noise. And April above all was noisy. The rivers swelled, fed by the meltwater from the mountains. Some overran their banks, flooding low fields, claiming paths that had been used for generations. Bridges weakened by frost sometimes collapsed. Roads were rerouted. The world had shifted in winter's absence, and now the people had to learn it again. Some, especially the elderly, did not recover quickly. Their bodies, worn thin by months of cold and hunger, failed to respond to the promise of spring. They lingered in a limbo of slow breaths and sunken eyes. Families cared for them gently, speaking in hushed tones, lighting candles when needed. If death came now, it was softer, less cruel than in December, but no less permanent. Children, in contrast, flourished. They grew louder, bolder. They wandered farther from home, chasing lambs, throwing pebbles into swollen streams, climbing the first trees to show new leaves. Their laughter returned to the fields like birdsong, hesitant at first, then uncontainable. It was their season now, the season of scraped knees, muddy feet and grass-stained hands. And the animals, oh how they rejoiced. Cattle stepped with more energy. Sheep scattered in wide fields, eager for fresh pasture. Birds nested. Hens began laying again. Even the dogs, lean and wary from winter, grew playful, chasing their own tails in patches of sunlight. But the people never let themselves forget. They spoke of winter as if it were a beast sleeping just beyond the ridge. They remembered the empty seats at tables, the graves only recently filled, the dreams still haunted by wind and frost. And so, even as they worked the land, they prepared once more. They salted what little meat they could spare. They set aside seed grain. They mended what had been broken. They looked to the hills and read the sky, cautious of clouds too thick, too low. No one trusted April entirely. At night, fires were still lit, but smaller. Songs were sung, softer, simpler. Stories changed. No longer just tales of survival, but of future things. Weddings to come, journeys to take. Crops they hoped would grow tall and golden, and through it all, the land breathed. It exhaled frost and inhaled life. The bones of the hills thawed, the lochs shimmered, the glens, once muted and buried, sang again in colour, even if only in hints. April was not a reward, it was a beginning, and the people, weathered and wiser, knew how to begin again. May swept across the Scottish countryside like a sigh of relief. Not loud, not boastful, but unmistakably warm. It was the first month in which people allowed themselves to believe, if only a little, that the worst had truly passed. The days were now longer, stretching slowly and confidently into the evening. The sun, once a stranger glimpsed briefly on the horizon, now lingered like a guest who didn't want to leave. And when it shone, truly shone, lit up the hills in a way that made the memory of snow seem distant, almost imagined. The earth responded first. Fields that had been turned in April now wore a soft green coat. Sprigs of barley and oat poked through the soil, tentative but determined. Peas wrapped their curling fingers around sticks. Wildflowers, hardy and small, bloomed at the edges of crofts and along the banks of streams. Gorse, with its fierce yellow blossoms, crowned the hills like torches. And the trees, oh, the trees, they whispered with new leaves, pale and trembling, like secrets being told after a long silence. The people noticed. How could they not? They shed layers of wool and fur, not completely, never completely, but enough to feel the air on their skin. They walked straighter, spoke louder, worked longer. The sun kissed their faces, turning pale cheeks golden. Children played barefoot in the softer ground, chasing dragonflies, collecting stones warm from sunlight. And in every village, preparations began for the month's oldest ritual, Beltane, the fire festival, marking the midpoint between spring and summer. It was both sacred and wild, steeped in memory older than any written page. Though the church had tried to dampen its glow, the people remembered. They always remembered. In the last days of April, they began to gather kindling. Not just any wood, but sacred wood, oak, ash, rowan. It was laid in secret places, protected from the rain, guarded from hungry flames meant for everyday cooking. These fires would not be for warmth, they would be for passage, because Beltane was more than celebration, it was transformation. On the eve of May 1st, the villages lit twin fires, tall, bright, crackling into the night. People, entire families, would pass between them, walking slowly, solemnly, as if through a gateway. It was said to purify, to protect, to bring health to those who walked and to the animals that followed. Cattle were led between the fires too, their hooves unsure but their eyes trusting. Smoke curled around their flanks like soft arms, and after the rite came the joy. There were dances, circles woven beneath the stars, flowers braided into hair, songs sung with open voices echoing across the glens. The people leapt the dying embers, laughing, casting off fear like old cloaks. It was a night when the land breathed freely. Lovers met in the woods, wishes were whispered to the moon. Offerings of milk, honey and oatcakes were left at stones in hollow trees beside still pools, not out of fear, but out of reverence. For the land had survived, the people had endured, and they owed thanks. But even after the fires had burned down and Beltane's songs faded into dawn, May's work resumed. The pace quickened now. Crops needed tending, weeds pulled, fences mended, roofs checked for moss and weakness. Lambs born earlier in the spring grew rowdy, needing herding, guiding. Calves suckled with more urgency. Chickens scratched deeper into the warm dirt, laying more frequently. Food returned, though slowly. Greens were foraged, nettles, wild garlic, dandelion leaves. Not luxurious, but fresh. Eggs became common again. Butter was churned. Cheese, soft and crumbly, returned to tables. The first real meals in months, still modest, still rationed, but full of flavour, of life. At market gatherings, people traded not just goods, but stories, news from nearby valleys, rumours of weather patterns, word of a particularly good planting in the south, or a strange sickness among cattle in a neighbouring glen. The social fabric, once shrunken by winter's weight, stretched again, threads rewoven, but not everything was rebirth. Some scars lingered, the crofts with empty doorways, the silent homes no longer visited. Children who asked where someone had gone and were met with long silences. May warmed the land, but grief thawed slower. It needed time. It always did. And then there was the memory of winter, still coiled in the corners of each mind. Even in sunlight, people glanced to the north, to the mountains that still wore white crowns. They knew better than to trust the season completely. A cold wind could still come. A late frost, a sudden storm. So they balanced joy with caution. They celebrated, yes, but quietly, purposefully. A few families began small journeys again, walking to distant kin, carrying news, settling debts. The roads were still rough, but no longer impassable. Inns reopened, alehouses grew louder. The land was waking, and so were its people. At night, windows were left open just a little, letting in the scent of earth, of grass, of things growing. Fires were banked early, songs carried farther. The stars seemed to shine with less malice. The children, many of whom had no memory of the deepest cold, sang their own little verses, nonsense rhymes made of sticks and shadows, woven through with the language of joy. Their feet danced on soil their parents had feared might stay frozen forever. And the elders watched them, silent, smiling, remembering. May was not the height of bounty, but it was the threshold of hope. And for those who had survived the long silence of snow, that was enough to sing, enough to plant, enough to believe again in warmth that stayed. June came not as a whisper, but as a quiet hum, the land no longer hesitant in its awakening, but fully awake, stretching beneath the long golden days like a creature basking after a long hibernation. Where earlier months had been slow and cautious, June was confident. Not bold, the Scottish summer rarely dared to boast, but certain in its rhythm. The light stretched further now. Dawn came early, slipping its pale fingers across the heathered hills before even the birds had begun their chorus. And the dusk, that soft, lingering dusk, refused to fall completely, hovering like a lullaby above the glens, keeping the dark at bay. To the people of medieval Scotland, June was a time of motion. Every part of the countryside echoed with activity. The fields, now green and vibrant, demanded tending. Oats stood tall and swayed in the breeze. Barley shimmered gold at the edges, and the beans climbed upward as though racing the sun. Days were long, but never long enough. From first light to the last, there was work. Children, once free to roam, were given duties now. They scattered feed for chickens, fetched water from the streams, collected eggs and wild greens. Even the smallest hands had a role. There was a season for everything, and June was for giving back to the land that had held them through the cold. Women moved through the gardens and crofts with baskets on their hips, eyes scanning the soil for weeds, the sky for signs of storms. Their hands were calloused, but their touch remained gentle, with plants, with animals, with each other. They sang again while they worked, soft tunes that drifted through the air like birdsong, filling the spaces between breaths. The men repaired what had not yet been mended. They strengthened fences, guided the oxen, shaped tools against whetstones worn thin from years of use. Their brows darkened with sweat now instead of soot. And at night, when they sat beside their hearths, now used more for cooking than warmth, their backs ached with the satisfaction of labour rather than the tension of survival. The animals flourished. The sheep, freshly sheared, grazed across the open hills, their wool now stored for spinning and sale. Calves had grown sturdy, goats nimble. Chickens were plump again, their feathers glossy in the sun. Even the dogs, lean and loyal through winter, ran with joy, chasing nothing in particular, simply because they could. And the lochs, deep, ancient mirrors scattered across the highlands, began to shimmer again. Mists lifted by midday, revealing waters dark and still, save for the occasional ripple of a fish or the quiet dip of a heron's wing. At night, Their surfaces reflected stars so clearly that the villagers often said the heavens had twin brothers sleeping beneath the waves. With summer came trade. Paths once blocked by snow and sludge were open now, and traders moved between villages, bringing goods, wool, cheese, carved wares and stories. A new tax in a neighbouring shire, a noble's marriage, the return of a ship from Orkney with strange fabrics and dried fruit. These travellers were welcome, if cautiously. No one in the Highlands ever forgot how quickly the world could turn. But the greatest gatherings were still the ones formed not for coin but for kin. June was the month of handfastings. Marriage rites, both old and new, were often held now, when the earth was warm and forgiving. A simple circle of flowers, a knot tied between two wrists, vows spoken beneath the open sky. Some followed the church's rites, others the older ways, but all were blessed by the land itself. Feasts were modest, no lavish spreads, no roasted boars, but hearty. Oatcakes, fresh cheese, butter, early greens, and ale brewed with herbs. The music was made from pipes, drums, and voices. And the dancing was wild. Shoes kicked off, hands joined, laughter rising into the dusk. It was in these moments that the people truly felt the season change inside them. Winter became a memory, not a presence. Hunger became a story told, not a shadow in the belly. And though grief lingered, it always did, it softened in the long days, became a part of the music, not a silence behind it. Still, they were careful. June could be kind, but it could also be cruel. Storms came fast, carried on winds that curled down from the north with surprising force. A single night of hail could ruin weeks of labour. A failed crop was not just a loss, it was a warning of what might come again. So they watched the sky. They watched the bees, the birds, the way the sheep lay in the fields. The old ones could read these signs, and the young were taught to see them. A cloud shaped wrong, a sudden shift in air, a bird nesting too low. These were omens, warnings, gifts of awareness. In churches and by sacred wells, prayers were offered, not for riches but for balance. A gentle rain, a steady sun, no fires, no floods, just enough, always just enough. And sometimes alone in a quiet field, someone would pause, straighten and simply look. At the hills rolling out like green waves, at the distant shimmer of a river, at the sky stretched wide above them. And in that pause they would feel it, the miracle of the moment. Not one of grandeur or glory, but of continuation. They had endured, and now they had begun again. June was not a reward, it was a reprieve, and the wise knew to cherish it. Carefully, reverently, gratefully. July arrived in a hush of heat, not the sweltering, suffocating kind known in other lands, but a gentler warmth that settled over the highlands like a woolen shawl warmed by the sun. It was the season of stillness between storms, the midpoint of growth, and the quiet breath the land took before the next turning. The hills, once grey and white, now swelled in deep greens and golds. Wildflowers bloomed along every path, foxglove, harebell, and the purple thistle, proud and defiant, leaning into the breeze. Bees hovered, their hum a constant thread through the long days, and above it all the sky stretched wide, pale blue with streaks of feathered cloud, rarely still, always moving. The people felt the tempo shift, the frenzy of planting was behind them, and the scythe of harvest had not yet begun its song. This was a time for maintaining, for waiting, for measuring each day not by the number of tasks, but by the depth of its silence, its light, its promise. The mornings began early, the sun already warm by the time the crofts stirred. Smoke rose slowly from chimneys, not from the need to banish cold, but to warm the morning bread, to boil the day's porridge. Men stepped outside with bare forearms, their faces turned instinctively to the sky, eyes narrowing at the colour of the clouds. Weather was still a language they understood intimately. Children woke before they were called, eager to roam, their laughter echoing down slopes and into gullies. Their games changed with the season, chasing butterflies through long grasses, balancing on stone walls warmed by sunlight, leaping over shallow burns swollen with snowmelt now turned sweet and cool. In the fields the barley whispered. It was tall now, almost shoulder height in some places, and the way it moved in the wind, waves upon waves, gave the illusion of the land breathing. The oats too stood proudly, not yet ripe, but promising. The farmers walked the rows slowly, fingertips brushing the heads of grain, murmuring quietly, as if afraid to speak too loudly and awaken misfortune. Gardens flourished. Peas curled up their trellises, onions swelled beneath the earth, cabbages unfurled their thick, waxy leaves. Every green thing grew with a kind of slow joy. Each harvest, though small, was met with gratitude. A basket of carrots, a bowl of berries, a handful of herbs. These were victories, not of conquest, but of harmony. July was the season of shepherds. In the hills above the villages, where the winds never fully ceased and the skies seemed to begin, they moved with their flocks. Sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, they followed the paths of the sheep like shadows, quiet, watchful. They knew each hollow, each stone outcrop, each hidden spring. Their dogs worked beside them, not needing commands, reading the flock as clearly as the shepherds read the sky. At night, they slept beneath cloaks or small stone shelters. They lit small fires, ate from bags of oatcakes and dried meat, and told stories to each other or to no one at all. Stories of wolves glimpsed far off, of a star that moved strangely, of dreams dreamt high above the world that felt too real to be only dreams. Back in the villages, the pace of life softened further. Women took to spinning wool again in the shade of stone walls. Their fingers moved with muscle memory, their voices low, sharing news or songs passed down from their mothers and their mothers before them. There were fairs too, modest gatherings where people traded goods, shared meals, and met others from neighbouring hamlets. These were not the grand markets of distant towns, but smaller, more intimate affairs. A pot for a handful of cheese, a carved spoon for a length of homespun. Coins were rare, barter was the language of July. Weddings still occurred, though less frequently than in spring. These were simpler unions, a blessing beneath a tree, a circle of friends singing as the couple shared bread and ale. No grand feasts, but enough to fill the belly, enough to mark the day. And through it all, the land listened. It had opened itself fully now. Birds nested openly. Deer wandered into the lower woods. The air smelled of heather, of pine, of sun-warmed stone. It was a time of plenty, but not extravagance. The people had learned, year upon year, that abundance was not a promise. It was a gift, and gifts must be honoured. They still remembered, each of them, the sting of frost in the marrow, the ache of hunger that had made even old root vegetables seem precious. So now, in July's gentle glow, they prepared, quietly, respectfully. Some food was preserved, early berries dried, herbs hung in bundles above the hearth, plans whispered for the harvest soon to come. The old ones watched all of this with eyes that had seen many seasons. They sat in shaded corners or on benches near doors, hands idle but hearts alert. They saw the curve of the barley and knew how high the snow would fall. They heard the cries of the swallows and remembered years when they came later, or not at all. They did not speak often, but when they did, others listened. And at night, when the day's light finally slipped away into a long golden dusk, the air cooled just enough to remind the people that the sun too could sleep. Fires were lit again, not from necessity but tradition. Meals were shared, ale poured, songs sung in low, winding tunes, not for celebration but for remembrance. It was in these July evenings, when everything felt just warm enough, just alive enough, that the people began to feel, truly feel, the fragile joy of peace. A peace earned, a peace held like water cupped in two hands. They knew better than to grip it too tightly, but for now they let it rest. Let it soothe the calluses, fill the silence, and cradle their dreams in softness. August settled over the highlands with the weight of ripening grain and the promise of labour. It was a golden month, heavy and humming, a time when the world seemed full to its brim, teetering at the edge of bounty, but never quite spilling over. The fields no longer whispered, they rustled with purpose. The barley, tall and honey-coloured, bowed under its own fullness. The oats stood alert, their heads nodding in the wind. Even the weeds grew fat now, tangling themselves between rows, daring to compete with the crops that had survived storms, frost, and thin soil. For the people, August was not a time of rest, it was harvest. At first light, the reaping began. The men, sleeves rolled, tools sharp, stepped into the fields in lines. Sickles in hand, they bent low, slicing the grain with practiced sweeps. The motion was repetitive, almost meditative, but demanding. Sweat gathered quickly beneath caps and collars. The sun in August was not always kind. Women followed, tying sheaves, gathering what had been cut, stacking it in careful bundles. Their hands worked with a rhythm that echoed through generations, fast, deliberate, respectful. There was reverence in this act. Every stalk mattered. Every grain was a debt repaid by the earth. Children darted at the edges, chasing field mice flushed from their burrows, gathering stray stalks, carrying water to the tired. They were not idle. There was no space for idleness in August. Voices carried across the fields, but only in bursts. A warning shout. A soft tune hummed under breath. A cry of pain when a blade found flesh instead of grain. The work demanded focus, and the people gave it. But even amidst the labour there was joy. A kind of deep, honest joy born from the promise of survival. Each sheaf gathered was a day of food. Each basket filled was a shield against the cold months to come. The work continued until the shadows grew long. At day's end, those who could still stand helped load the carts. The grain, though not yet threshed, was brought in, stored under thatched shelters, protected from the threat of sudden storms. Rains could still come in August, and a single day's downpour could ruin an entire field. So they moved quickly, efficiently. Nights in August were cooler now. The air carried a hint of what lay ahead. Not winter, not yet, but something beyond summer. The fire was lit again in earnest, not just for food, but for warmth. Cloaks were pulled from chests and aired. Beds were fluffed with fresh straw. It was a quiet preparation, unspoken but felt. In the villages, the rhythm of life matched the fields. Markets grew busier as harvests came in. The baker's hearth blazed from dawn to dusk, filling the air with the scent of new bread, thick loaves, dense and nourishing. Berries were gathered by the basketful and preserved with honey or dried by the fire. Herbs, now at their fullest, were cut and bound, hung from rafters in fragrant bundles. The animals, too, sensed the change. Cattle grew restless as the grazing began to thin. Chickens wandered closer to homes. Dogs followed their masters more closely, eyes alert, ears flicking at every sound. The flocks were counted again, as they always were this time of year, each lamb accounted for, each ewe watched carefully. And yet, even in this season of toil, there were moments of celebration. Lugnasad, the ancient Gaelic festival marking the beginning of harvest, was still observed, though more quietly than in centuries past. In the hills and glens where tradition ran deep, fires were lit on the first of the month. Bread made from the first grain was broken and shared. Games were played, stories told. Some climbed hills to give thanks. Others walked the fields barefoot, believing the land would recognise their steps and bless the soil for next year. Offerings were left in secret places, coins in a well, a ribbon tied to a tree, a carved token buried near a stone. It was not paganism to them, nor superstition. It was memory, a way of saying thank you to the world that had not forgotten them. There were weddings in August, too, rushed sometimes so that two households might harvest together. Babies born in spring were now round-cheeked, their laughter a balm after days of bending and lifting. Elders, though unable to work the fields, sat nearby, shelling peas, spinning wool, offering wisdom. Their presence was a thread, holding it all together. And as the month wore on, the light began to shift. It came in at a different angle, softer somehow, casting longer shadows across the fields. The nights grew louder with crickets and the occasional bark of a fox. The lochs lost their summer stillness, stirred again by evening winds that smelled of moss and coming rain. The people noticed. Of course they did. They felt it in their bones, in knees that ached again, in breath that clouded faintly at dawn. They counted the days differently now, not from sunrise to sunset, but in sheaves and sacks, in jars sealed and root cellars stocked, in tasks ticked off by the rhythm of need, and still they laboured, for the harvest did not wait. And winter, though hidden behind the hills, had already begun its slow approach. August was a month of fulfilment, yes, but also of foresight, and the people of the land, shaped by every winter that had come before, knew that joy and preparation must always walk hand in hand. September came not with a whisper, but with a breath held between seasons, a slow, deep inhalation before the exhale of winter began once more. It was a month of amber and ash, of skies that darkened more quickly, and of air that carried the scent of wood smoke and endings. The landscape, so recently drenched in the fullness of summer, began its slow retreat. The greens of August faded, dulled by cooler nights and shortened days. In their place came golds and russets, ochres and browns. The hills no longer sang with life, they murmured now, low and sombre, as if preparing themselves for the silence to come. In the fields, the last of the harvest was gathered. Any grain still standing was cut quickly, desperately, before rains could come. The oats especially were watched with a kind of anxious reverence. A week too long and they might sprout in the husk, ruined. A frost too early and the work of months could vanish overnight. The threshing began. It was hard, rhythmic labour, the beating of sheaves to separate grain from chaff. It echoed across the glens like a drumbeat, steady and relentless. The barns were filled with movement, men with flails, children gathering the loosened seeds, women sweeping, sifting, storing. Dust clung to every surface. It shimmered in shafts of light. It scratched at throats. But no one complained. This was the pulse of survival. And as the grain came in, so too did the reckoning. Every household took measure. How many sacks? How many jars? Was it enough? Fingers traced tallies carved into wood. Heads were shaken, mouths tightened. Some had plenty, others less. There were quiet trades, a bushel of oats for a fleece, a pot of honey for a barrel of barley. Debts were remembered, some forgiven, others not. In the gardens, the last of the root vegetables were pulled. Carrots with their long tendrils, turnips still heavy with soil, leeks, their stalks pale and fragrant. These were cleaned, bundled, and hung or buried, depending on the method known best to each family. Apples were picked, those that had not fallen already. Bruised ones were stewed down, turned into mash or cider. The best were wrapped carefully in straw and stored in baskets in cool corners. Pears, plums and brambles were gathered while they still clung to the branches. The tartness of fruit in September was a taste that lingered long in memory, both sweet and sharp, like the season itself. And then there were the animals. The livestock were counted again, their condition checked. The fields were thinning now, grass turning brittle beneath the first frosts. Cattle were moved to richer pastures if they could be found. Pigs, fattened all summer, were watched carefully. Some would not see October. Their meat would be salted, smoked, and hung. It was a grim decision, but necessary. You fed those who remained with the sacrifice of those who did not. Even the chickens, once allowed to wander freely, were now kept closer. Eggs were fewer now. The birds sensed the change in the light, their laying slowed. The foxes grew bolder, and so the pens were reinforced, the barns repaired, the thatch checked and packed, every roof, every shutter, every door inspected for cracks, leaks, gaps. It was not paranoia, it was wisdom. Rain could come at any moment. Snow not far behind, a house that let in cold would not keep it out again. The fires, long allowed to die down through summer, were now fed in earnest. Peat was stacked higher. Wood was chopped and split. The smell of smoke curled upward from nearly every chimney, soft and spiralling, marking homes where people prepared, not just for weather but for time itself. Because September was a turning, not a beginning, not an end, but something in between. A place where breath caught and the heart looked both forward and back. In the churches, prayers grew longer, more solemn. The priests spoke of harvests in the Bible, of stewardship, of thankfulness, but also of humility, of how quickly bounty could become scarcity. The people listened, some with folded hands, others with folded arms. They knew these things already, etched into their bones. The sermons only named what they already felt. And in the evenings when the work was done, the songs changed. The music of midsummer, bright, wild, full of lilt, gave way to something slower, ballads often. Songs of partings, of lovers separated by snow, of sailors caught in early storms, of mothers rocking babes beside dying fires. The fires crackled, shadows danced. Stories returned too, not the playful tales of selkies and fairy rings, but the deeper ones. Stories of loss and endurance, of ancestors who had walked the same paths, planted the same fields, faced the same cruel winds. These stories were not told to frighten, but to remind that they had done it before and would do it again. Outside, the locks stilled, their surfaces darkened, no longer reflecting sunlight but gathering shadow. The forests, once full of noise, grew quieter. Birds began their slow migration. Deer were seen more often, near roads, in fields, their eyes wide and watchful, and the people watched too. They watched the sky, where stars returned earlier each night. They watched the horizon, where mist gathered more thickly with each morning. They watched each other, neighbours, friends, kin, for signs of worry, of need, of readiness. September asked nothing loudly, but it whispered constantly, and those who listened, truly listened, knew what it meant. It meant that time was narrowing, that the world was about to turn, and that what was gathered, built, mended and remembered in these days would carry them through what came next. October crept in like a low mist curling through the glens, soft, slow and utterly certain. It did not announce itself with storms or sudden frost. It arrived quietly, changing the light, deepening the shadows and shifting the very rhythm of life. In October, the days shortened not by minutes, but by whole moods. Mornings grew reluctant, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise. Afternoons dimmed prematurely, cloaked in grey veils that dulled colour and sound. And night became something ancient again, a space not merely for sleep, but for caution, for memory, for reverence. The people of medieval Scotland moved differently now. Their steps were less hurried, more deliberate. They no longer chased daylight, they yielded to its fading. The urgency of harvest had passed, and with it came a quieter urgency, preservation. Everything gathered now had to last. Every fruit, every root, every grain had to stretch across months, yet unseen. Inside the crofts, the world narrowed. The windows, small and few, allowed in only what light the day would spare. Herbs hung from beams, drying in clusters like old secrets, bundles of garlic, strings of onions, clumps of sage, rosemary and thyme. The air inside was sharp with their scent, a mingling of warmth and warning. In the corners, barrels of salted meat waited. Turnips were heaped like pale stones beneath straw. Jars of honey, carefully sealed, caught what little sunlight there was, glowing like captured fire. Some crofts had cheeses wrapped in cloth. Others had dried fish, smoked and curled from the rafters. Not all larders were full, but most were full enough, and so the work turned inward. Spinning began again in earnest. Wool from the summer shearing, now clean and carded, was pulled and twisted between fingers into long threads. The spinning wheel hummed low through the evenings, a lullaby for the tired. Women wove by firelight, shaping the cloth that would cloak their kin through the months ahead. Blankets, tunics, mittens, shawls, all born from the simple rhythm of wheel and hand. Men turned their focus to repair, tools sharpened once more. Sleds built, snares checked, leather soaked, stretched, cut and stitched. Hides from the slaughtered pigs were scraped and cured. Nothing wasted. Every piece of every animal had a place, a purpose. The children helped where they could, fetching water, sorting kindling, learning the tasks in small, patient steps. They played less now, not from sadness but from understanding. The land had entered its serious season, and they too must meet it with care. Yet October was not without its beauty. The trees, before they were stripped bare, caught fire with colour. Rowan, birch and alder turned gold and crimson, their leaves fluttering like flames in the wind. The bracken reddened on the hillsides. The heather, now fading, gave way to mosses that glowed green under morning dew. And the sky, oh the sky, became a gallery of drama. Clouds thick and fast, layered like folds of grey wool. Sunlight pierced through them in shafts, sudden and divine. Rainbows curved briefly over the glens, then vanished. Rain came and went in veils, gentle and persistent. Fires became central again, not just for heat, but for light, for gathering. The hearth was the heart of the home once more. Meals were made slowly. Thick stews of barley, bits of meat, and whatever roots were plentiful. Bread baked in iron pans, dense and dark. Broth simmered for hours. And when the fire burned low, stories replaced the boil of the pot. It was during October that the oldest tales were told. Tales of the Kayak, the ancient hag of winter who wandered the mountains now, gathering frost in her apron. Of spirits walking at dusk, drawn by the smell of peat and the sound of singing. Of the thin places, stone circles, cave mouths, lone trees, where the worlds brushed close and breath could be shared between the living and the dead. The people listened with quiet attention, not from fear, but from memory, because October was not just about cold or harvest or light. It was about the boundary between what is and what was. A thinning veil. Samhain approached, the turning of the Celtic year, the ancient hinge upon which the seasons swung. Though the church had grafted new names onto the day, All Hallows, All Saints, the people still felt its original shape. Samhain was not a feast of frivolity. It was a reckoning, a remembering. In the final days of the month, candles were placed in windows. Lanterns, sometimes carved from turnips, were lit and left outside to guide the wandering spirits. Offerings were made in small, quiet gestures, a bowl of milk near the door, a crust of bread on a windowsill. Not for ghosts, but for ancestors. For those who had walked the same paths, weathered the same winters, and now watched from beyond the veil. There were no costumes, no merriment, only acknowledgement, only silence, fire, and the wind. Some said the dead whispered in October, that their voices could be heard in the crackle of leaves, the shifting of rafters, the cry of an owl at night. Others simply bowed their heads and murmured a name. A father, a daughter, a friend buried last winter. The land echoed with their memory, and so the people met October not with celebration, but with grace. They slowed, they listened, they folded themselves inward just as the trees let go of their leaves, just as the sun loosened its grip on the hills. There was beauty in the letting go, and in that beauty a lesson, that even in retreat there is purpose, that even in darkness there is reverence, and that every ending is only the beginning of a deeper, quieter song. November descended like a breath held too long, not sudden, not jarring, but inescapable. It pressed softly at first, with mist and shadow, and then with wind. Cold, deliberate wind that slipped beneath door frames, curled between the threads of woven wool, and stirred the last of the dead leaves into restless flight. The world turned grey, not lifeless, not yet, but muted. As though the land had decided to speak in quieter tones, the golds of October had faded. The reds had fallen. What remained were the skeletal limbs of trees reaching toward a colourless sky. The heather had browned, the mosses dulled. Even the locks, once sparkling under summer sun, now brooded under skies the colour of pewter. November was the month of memory. The people felt it in their bones, in their silence, in their breath that steamed in the morning and lingered like smoke before vanishing. They spoke less now. Movements slowed. Voices dropped. Everything turned inward, not just physically, but spiritually. The work continued, of course. It had to, but it shifted, taking on the weight of winter's inevitability. Peat was still cut in the lowlands where the bogs remained soft enough. The blocks were hauled in heavy bundles, stacked under eaves and against outer walls, forming walls of dark, dry fuel. The smell of peat smoke, rich, ancient, comforting, now hung in the air at all hours, curling around chimneys like sentinels. Water was fetched with greater care. The streams sometimes froze at the edges now. A thin skin of ice would crack underfoot, and the more daring children learned to test it with their fingers before stepping across. The first true frosts had arrived. Crisp, glittering veils spread across fields each morning, and footprints marked where feet had passed like ghost trails. Livestock were brought closer. The fields could no longer feed them, and so they were sheltered, tethered or corralled. Cattle lowed in cold barns, sheep huddled in pens padded with straw, chickens roosted high in the beams, feathers fluffed against the cold. Dogs curled by the hearth, and cats, when they chose to stay, claimed warm corners without apology. Inside the homes, preparation turned to endurance. The winter garments were now worn daily. Cloaks lined with sheepskin. Mittens fashioned from old wool. Stockings layered, children were bundled like packages, their laughter muffled beneath scarves. Every breath that escaped into the air crystallized and vanished. Even speech in the coldest morning seemed slower. The meals changed too. Gone were the fresh greens, the ripe fruits, the plump berries. Now came stews, thick, dark, nourishing. Turnips, carrots, bits of dried meat. Barley thickened the broth, and herbs, long dried and stored, gave what flavour could be spared. Bread was harder now, baked in larger loaves to last longer, torn instead of sliced. Ale was brewed thicker, darker and stronger to warm bellies and soften sleep. And for those with access to it, mead was brought out, a celebration of honey's sweetness preserved from the summer hives. In the evenings, life pulled in close. Fires burned steadily. The youngest children fell asleep early, lulled by the flickering glow and the rhythm of the wheel or the murmur of old songs. The adults mended, carved and spun. The elders told stories, not just of spirits and seasons, but of their own youth, of winters past, of journeys walked, lovers lost, lands remembered. And it was during these evenings that the tales of the Cailleach returned in earnest. The old woman of winter, the veiled one, the mountain wanderer. She was said to walk among the peaks now, turning every stream to ice with her staff, shaking snow from her apron with each storm. The children listened wide-eyed as they learned how to spot her footprints in frost, how to leave small offerings of bread or milk at the foot of old stones so she might pass their home without pause. But no one feared her completely. She was not evil, they said, only ancient, a reminder, a keeper of the balance. Just as spring had its maidens and summer its queens, winter too needed its sovereign, and so she was honoured, quietly, through whispered tales and silent gestures. Outside, the nights grew longer still. The stars, when they appeared, did so with startling clarity. Constellations etched themselves across the sky like runes. Orion returned, his belt gleaming above the eastern hills. The moon rode higher, casting silver light across the rooftops and fields, painting even the darkest night with a glow that felt otherworldly. Some said the dead walked more easily in November, that the veil, though thickening again after Samhain, was still thin enough for dreams to be visited, for voices to be heard in the sigh of the wind. There were reports, quiet, rarely spoken aloud, of candles blown out with no wind, of doors swinging gently open, of the smell of a familiar perfume in an empty room. But such things were not feared, they were part of the season. November was not cruel, it was reflective, a time to look back, to count not only what had been harvested, but what had been lost, what had been kept, what had been learned. In the churches, prayers were spoken more fervently, for the sick, for the aged, for the unborn child whose mother now wore more layers, walked more slowly and warmed her belly by the fire. The priest lit candles, not just for saints but for souls unnamed, those buried without kin, those forgotten by time. And in every croft, no matter how poor, one candle was always saved, to be lit on the coldest nights. A single flame, a promise that light, however small, could hold against the dark. November did not ask for celebration, only remembrance, only endurance. And in the hearts of the people, shaped by winters long past and winters yet to come, there lived a quiet understanding that this season, with all its weight and hush, was not the death of the year, but its sleep. And in that sleep, a preparation for something more. December arrived with a hush, not silence exactly, but a deepening of quiet. A stillness layered atop the land like fresh snow, soft and absolute. It came not with celebration, but with a slow exhale. The year, nearly spent, lay down gently beneath the weight of its final month. The days were now brief flickers between two long shadows. Light rose reluctantly and fell with haste. Even at midday, the sun slung low in the sky, casting long, cold beams that barely warmed the skin. On clouded days, the light was a ghost, pale, indistinct, and gone before it was fully noticed. The frost no longer came and went, it stayed. It curled around the rims of buckets, lined the inside of windows with fern-like patterns, and clung to fence posts like lacework spun from breath. The ground, once muddy and giving, had hardened beneath boots. Steps echoed differently now, crisp, final, thin. Snow began to fall, not always in heavy storms, but in soft layers, light at first, tall, then thicker, persistent. It covered rooftops and hedgerows, smoothed the contours of hills, and turned every path into a forgotten road. Footprints filled overnight, landmarks vanished. Even sound changed under snow, muffled and more distant, as though the world was folding inward. Inside the crofts, the fire never died. It was tended constantly, its coals banked at night, its heat watched with reverence. The hearth became the sun, centre of time, of story, of sustenance. Everything revolved around it now. Food was prepared close to it. Children played near it. Elders sat beside it with blankets on their knees and memories in their laps. Meals were simple, repetitive, necessary. Broth, bread, root vegetables softened in the pot, dried meat added sparingly. Some families still had cheese, though it was now crumbly and sharp. Others brought out jars of preserved fruit, gooseberries, blackcurrants, apples. A spoonful was a luxury. A second was celebration, and for those with bees there was honey, golden and thick, a warmth born in summer now enjoyed by firelight. December was a month of retreat, of folding in. The fields were abandoned, the tools stored, the animals, those not cold, kept close and fed carefully. Hens laid few eggs now, if any. The cows gave milk only in small amounts. Every task was slower, every movement deliberate. The people marked the days not by sun or shadow, but by ritual. Each morning a check of the roof, the fire, the food. Each evening a prayer, a story, a cup passed between hands. Time was counted in hours spent beside loved ones, in chores completed, in candles burned halfway down. Outside, the wind moved restlessly through the thatch. Inside, the air was still and warm. The nights were vast, and in their dark the people dreamed. Not of grand futures, but of the simple hopes, a healthy spring lamb, a long enough frost to kill pests, a thaw that would not flood the fields. Dreams grounded in the rhythm of survival. In churches, the season of Advent had begun. Wreaths of holly and pine adorned stone arches. Candles were lit, one each Sunday, their light climbing slowly toward Christmas. Hymns were sung in low voices, psalms recited by heart. The priest spoke of waiting, of preparation, of light to come. But outside the church, the older rites remained. Evergreens were brought into homes. Branches of pine, holly and ivy hung above doorways, wrapped around beams, not for decoration, but for protection, for memory. A promise that life endured even in the deepest cold. And then there was the solstice, Yule, the longest night. A fire was kept burning, tended by watchful hands. Some families stayed awake through the night, talking softly, telling stories, tending the embers, waiting for the dawn. Not because they feared the dark, but because the return of light, however faint, deserved witness. There were no grand feasts for most, no towers of food or lavish spreads, but bread was broken, ale was poured. Sometimes a small cake was baked, with spices if any could be spared, a sprig of holly tucked beneath it, a symbol of hope. Children received small tokens, a carved charm, a woolen doll, a piece of fruit saved since summer. Their eyes lit up not because the gifts were great, but because they were given. In the cold of December, kindness warmed more than fire. Outside, the snow deepened. Wolves were sometimes heard at the edges of forests. Their howls pierced the stillness, reminding the people that they were not alone in their hunger, not the only ones watching the horizon for change. But the people did not fear. They had made it this far. The larder might be lean, the woodpile lower than hoped, but the heart was full, not of cheer, but of steadiness. December was not for dancing. It was for watching, waiting, enduring, for honouring the quiet. The stars above, now brilliant in the clear, cold sky, seemed closer, hung lower perhaps as if listening. Constellations told their own stories. The hunter, the hound, the sisters, each with a tale whispered from mouth to mouth beside the fire. And in the telling, the year folded itself up like a blanket laid gently over the shoulders of the earth. Not an end, but a pause, a breath drawn deep and slow beneath the snow. January emerged not as something new, but as something ancient remembered. Not a beginning, but a return. In the deep folds of midwinter, when the snow lay thick upon the earth and the trees stood like bones against a pale sky, January crept forward in silence. It carried no banners. It sang no songs. It simply was. The land had surrendered fully to winter. The hills no longer shifted. They rested, still and heavy beneath a blanket of white. The locks froze, their glassy surfaces rippling with cracks that echoed like whispers when the frost thickened at night. The trees stood bare, save for the evergreens, pines and firs, whose needles gathered snow in soft clusters. And in the villages the people moved slowly, wrapped in layers, their breath steaming in clouds as they stepped into the day. Each dawn was a small triumph. Light returned, but in hesitant fragments. The sun rose low and thin, casting long shadows across fields that had known no footsteps in days. Even the crows, those ragged watchers of the season, flew more cautiously now, their wings heavy, their cries fewer. Inside, the crofts were dim and warm. The hearth never cooled. Every ember mattered. Every log of wood or block of peat burned with purpose. People gathered closer. Even silence had a warmth to it, a companionship born of shared endurance. There was no idle talk in January. Words like firewood were used sparingly. The food was rationed more carefully than ever. What remained from the harvest had to stretch until the earth softened again. Barley, once a staple, was now spooned into pots by the handful, not the scoop. Dried beans, wrinkled and hard, were soaked overnight, simmered all day. Meat was rarely seen, and when it was taken in small bites, shared around the table, eaten slowly. And so hunger lingered, not always sharp or sudden, but constant. A background hum that settled into the belly and stayed. The children felt it most. They asked for more and were given smiles instead. Their parents chewed more slowly, drank more water, stood by the fire longer than they needed to, but still they endured. Outside, the work did not stop. It could not. Animals had to be fed. Snow had to be shoveled from rooftops before it became too heavy. Wood had to be split, water fetched through holes broken in frozen streams. Every task was harder in January, every breath colder. every mistake more dangerous. And the cold itself was no longer just a presence, it was a voice. It creaked in the wood beams overhead, it howled down the chimney, it slipped in through shutters and beneath doors, not like a thief, but like a patient visitor. The people did not try to fight it anymore. They acknowledged it, offered it space, kept it at the edge of the room, never closer. And when they rested, they dreamed. Not of spring, that was still too far, but of small things, a meal with enough, a night without wind, a morning when the water in the bucket wasn't frozen. They dreamed of warm wool, of song, of the sound of birds returning. They did not dream big in January. They dreamed true. Yet even in the hush of this hard month, there was life. Women still sang lullabies to children wrapped in layers of wool. Men told stories while sharpening blades dulled by ice. Elders recalled winters worse than this one, though always with a glint in the eye, as if daring the season to do its worst and be remembered in tale. Neighbours visited, cautiously, briefly. A knock at the door was answered quickly, for no one left a visitor standing in the cold. A basket might be exchanged, a few eggs, a roll of yarn, a tin of lard, a gesture of shared struggle, of wordless gratitude. Even the poorest gave something. And then at night came the stars. No month showed the stars like January. The sky, now cleared of summer's haze and autumn's clouds, opened wide above the hills, black and glittering, each constellation sharper, each breath under that sky sacred. Those who dared step outside for a moment's silence felt something profound. Not loneliness, but scale. The world stretched enormous and still, and yet they were a part of it. A speck in the long dark, but not alone. In the churches, the new year was spoken of with hope, a turning of the page, a chance to begin again. But in the crofts, the people did not speak of new beginnings. They knew better. Winter was not a clean start, it was a continuation, a deepening, a reminder of what must be carried before anything could be begun. And so they carried it, each bundle of wood, each spoonful of soup, each word shared by firelight. They carried the memory of the year behind them and the weight of the days ahead. They carried it all, not with complaint, but with quiet, steady grace, because this was January, the last mouth of winter's long song. And in its slow rhythm, the people moved, one foot in front of the other, one breath after the last, waiting, enduring, and listening, always listening, for the soft sound of thaw, the faintest drip, the earliest bird song, the moment when the cold at last began to release its hold. And when it came, as it always did, they would rise, not in triumph, but in quiet return. Because they had not merely survived winter, they had remembered how.